let's talk about a plectrum hamali. Don't worry, there's no quiz on the Latin names. This is better known as puttyroot orchid, sometimes called Adam and Eve. I like puttyroot orchid because the colonists used the root, it's kind of gelatinous, as glue, all right? So that was back in the days when there were tons of them. We don't do that anymore. So now this is one that you're going to see in the wintertime. And you know how DC weather is kind of off again, on again, and then we get those January days where you just got to get out of the house and into the woods. Well, this is what you're going to look for. You're going to find them in rich mesic forests or mesic woods. Mesic means basically kind of dry, upland. Upland, I think, is more appropriate because I don't think we're dry in the mid-Atlantic states at all. You're going to be looking for this very pleated basal leaf, about 4 to 8 inches long, maybe 1.5 to 3 inches wide. And it's really going to stick out because it's this kind of blue-green color, really shows off against the leaves. So the leaf comes up and does its photosynthetic thing when there's no leaves on the trees. And even though the winter sun is weak, there's no competition for photosynthesis. The leaves go dormant right about the time that the bloom stalk comes up. All right, and this is, I'm going to change my zoom ratio here just a little bit. That's better. Okay, this is about maybe 12 to 14 inches tall, and you can see it's kind of this rusty maroony brown and cream color, which means that in the spring vegetation or the spring leaves, in its bloom time, May through June, it's still pretty hard to see. So I usually, in areas where it is safe, I will flag the leaves so that I can come back.
It's just I like the other spoon.
I don't know what that was. Somebody mute yourself. All right, when it blooms, so I have half a chance of finding these. These are self-pollinating.
Yeah.
Next slide, please. All right, so its conservation status is globally secure, but it is fairly rare throughout much of its range. And you can see that if you take a look at Maryland, because I live in central Maryland, so I'm Maryland-centric, you can see that we have some areas of central Maryland where you can find it. You get out towards the Panhandle and into West Virginia and up into northern Virginia, and you can find these in areas where the disturbance is minimal. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so here's a better patch. I've now stepped away and you can see kind of how it grows in loose colonies. So now this is actually being propagated by seed from some specialty nurseries. So you can get it if you think that you have the right habitat. Now keep in mind, guys, orchids, terrestrial orchids in particular, have an extremely tight symbiosis with mycorrhizal fungi or fungi, more than one, fungus or fungi. So even if you can match the soil type, the light, the water, everything, you may or may not have the fungi and be able to transplant this. I do not strongly do not recommend on a whim moving some. If you have some in your backwoods, cherish it. All right, put a fence around it. Don't let the deer eat it, but leave it there. Don't try to move it to the front of your garden border. It will die dead. It will die dead permanently. So not one to fool around with. Now, in the face of bulldozer, all right, face of bulldozer. Now understand that you're probably on private property. And if you went to the developer and say, hey, can I dig your orchids? They would tell you, no way, get out of here. I will never make any kind of suggestion as to what your activity should be. But you probably know what mine would be. So if your push comes to shove, you could try taking sods. Most of our terrestrial orchids are going to live in, you're going to a little bit of a soil lesson here, in the humus duff, where the humus reaches the top, what we would call topsoil, okay, or the A layer. So in a typical rich woodland forest, you're going to have leaves, last year's leaves, pick it up, it looks like a leaf. It's going to be pretty whole. As you go deeper down into the pile, your leaves start breaking up. You can see that you don't know whether that's a beech or an oak leaf or a whatever leaf. And if you go deeper down towards the soil, you end up with black humusy stuff. Deeper than that, you're going to have the organic matter, the black humusy stuff, mixing with that mineral soil. If you go deeper, you'll hit pure mineral soil. Those orchid roots are going to run in that interface between the mineral soil and the coarse organic layer, like the leaves that are just getting chopped up by decomposers. So when you move them, if you have to move them, and if you don't have to move them, don't. You're going to take a sod, not deep, but very broad. These have rhizomes, so being able to move them with enough living root is going to be difficult. So definitely we need habitat protection against, you know, our local woodlands going to Targets or Walmarts. Next slide, please. All right. So while you're out trekking in the woods, and we're still in kind of a dry mesic forest, you might run across Tipillaria discolor, and it has the same kind of life cycle that our aplectrum has, okay? So you're going to find these leaves. Now, if you're sharp-eyed, you'll see that these leaves are a little bit wider at the base and taper more rapidly down to a point. And they're not as pleated. They don't have that linear veination quite as strongly as the aplectrum does. But the really, really good way to tell the two apart, because if you don't have one on each side to compare, the Tipillaria discolor, the cranefly orchid, has a maroon underside, unmistakable. Now, again, this guy goes summer dormant, is only the green leaf in the wintertime when it can photosynthesize without any tree competition. And then in July through September, so it just kind of finished its bloom cycle, you have this stalk, maybe about 14, 16 inches tall, of basically, I will blend into the leaves and you can't see me, bloom stalk. So if you have some on the backwoods or a protected area where you can flag this, in the wintertime, you know where the leaves are, you can go back in July and see if you can find the I'm so well camouflaged you can't see me bloom stalks. This pollinator, the pollinator for this orchid is a couple different species of, it's what's called a looper or a looper moth. All right, little tiny moths, believe it or not. Even though it's called cranefly orchid, no, its pollinator is the looper moth. And next slide, please, Serenella. Okay, so its conservation status is globally apparently secure, can be common in forests throughout the southeastern U.S. However, if in its northern part of the range, it gets kind of thin. And you'll notice on this map, I'm kind of paralyzed without my pointer. On this map, you've got central Maryland covered pretty good, northern Virginia covered pretty good. Yeah, thank you. A little bit down in southern Maryland. All right, and you notice that the green area goes all the way over into Annapolis. And I was in a park very close to Annapolis, and I found drifts, absolutely drifts. I would say that I had 25 and 30 individuals at a site. I was in seventh heaven seeing these leaves. It was in the wintertime, so it was darn cold, but oh, I was excited that I saw so many individuals of Tipillaria discolor. Now, I do have to make a couple of statements about why would they be rare, what's going on, and you're going to find out, I'm going to talk a little bit more about prevalence of certain orchids. Well, probably one of the biggest problems is habitat loss, and whose fault is that? That's us, all right? We're mowing down stands of native orchids to make housing developments and shopping centers and whatnot, our urban sprawl. And then, of course, quick on the heels of that, you have Bambi. Bambi loves orchids, doesn't even need a condiment with them, they'll just eat them. So that's a problem. And of course, if you follow E.O. Wilson et al. Is in his biodiversity, he says that one of the main threats to most of our rare and endangered plants is invasive species. So you've got habitat loss through human beings, you've got predaceous eating from Bambi, and you've got invasive species. So If you have a chunk of woods where you might think some of these species might actually be naturally occurring, try to remove and control the invasive species. And you'd be surprised, once you remove a bunch of invasive species, cool things might start popping up. So that would be my advice to you all. Can I have the next slide, please, Saranella? All right, so here you get to see the purple underside, and that's going to be the do I have putty root or do I have cranefly orchid? That's going to really sink it in. You can see that the leaf shape and the leaf color is a little bit different. It still has that parallel venation, but a little bit different tipularia to a plectrum. The flowers are seriously camouflage me, really, really hard to see. And yes, I have photographed them, and sometimes it takes several of us knowing that it's in the site to actually find it. So this is being grown from seed. It is being artificially propagated. So from seed or propagated from root cuttings, believe it or not, with this guy. So you can find it from some specialty nurseries. And again, it's got that rhizomatous root mass, that spreading root mass, and it's going to be difficult to move even in the face of a bulldozer. So a little note about buying native orchids. Okay, so eBay, don't go there. More than likely it's wild collected, and heaven only knows what you're going to get. So your artificially propagated native orchids are going to be more expensive. At the end of the presentation, I show you a little bit what goes into propagating native orchids, or terrestrial orchids, period, and I think you'll see why they're a little bit more expensive. So be cautious. When you go on a website from a supplier, you should insist, they should automatically have how that plant was propagated. Most honest companies are going to say seedling propagated, root cutting propagated, divisions from parent plants. They will tell you. If they don't tell you, question. Next slide, please. All right. One of my absolute favorites, Goodyeara pubescens. We actually have a couple of species of Goodyeara in our area. Pubescens is the one that I see most often. In fact, I've seen it in people's backyards in Tacoma Park and in Silver Spring. Yeah, they didn't know it was there until I showed them. This is quite stunning. Like the previous two, you're looking at a dry mixed forest. You're looking at basal leaves. All right, they form a rosette. Now you've got beautiful white venation against a green leaf. The whole plant is maybe 4x4 to 6x6, so it's you can see it. Now these are winter dormant, and you're going to find the rosettes in summertime. Sometime around August, if you're lucky and Bambi hasn't eaten them, all right, you'll find these stalks of little tiny white flowers. Okay, the stalk might be 12 to 14 inches. And if you're really lucky, you see a patch like that center picture and you think you've died and gone to heaven. So what is the designated pollinator? Sweat bees. Several species of little sweat bees. So annotation here, this is, orchids are not pollinated by generalist pollinators. They have a very, very close coevolution with their pollinator, and for that reason, if we lose the pollinator, we use the plant. If we lose the plant, we lose the pollinator. So all the more reason for habitat preservation. And I'll get off my soapbox now. Next slide, please, Saranella. All right, conservation status, globally secure, but maybe rare in southern states. So now this guy is kind of range goes more towards the north. You can see Northern Virginia and Maryland is well covered, Delaware into New Jersey, Southern Pennsylvania, and well into West Virginia. So I promised you an hour's drive. Yep, you can find them. Next slide, please. All right, in the garden. This plant can be found in many retail nurseries, and you can buy it without guilt. It's being artificially propagated. I think they can actually mariclone this. It can be grown easily from seed. Professionally, it's a little difficult for you and me to grow. It also can be transplanted successfully, but again, in the face of bulldozer. If you have a natural area where this is proliferating, I suggest that you cage it so that Bambi can't get at it. You can let those flower stalks grow, because that's really what Bambi likes to eat. The deer love the flower stalks. And that way you'll have some pollination going on, because the sweat bee species are pretty common, and that's the best way to get it to proliferate in situ. Now, a note, it can be transplanted successfully, such as in the face of a bulldozer, again, but note that it's usually found on the north side of a slope where the leaves blow off of the crown. So during the winter, the crown is not going to want to be choked up with mulch. That's not going to work for them. They'll rot out. So the north side of a slope where usually the leaves blow away in the wintertime. Okay, next slide, please. All right, still sticking with our rich mesic forest, Galliera spectabilis, say that 10 times. All right, our showy orchid. This thing is gorgeous, absolutely gorgeous. Now we're talking about upward facing, glossy, ovate, broad ovate leaves, maybe up to 8 inches long. They're a little glaucous in color, so they're not that deep green, they're a little bit of a blue-green color. It is winter dormant. I see it in bloom usually that window May 1st to Mother's Day, and that's when I usually find them. But further north, it'll be more towards June, or higher altitudes, it'll be more towards June. So now the pollinator is several different kinds of queen bumblebees. So I don't know if you know anything about bumblebees, but the queen overwinters kind of sheltered down in probably leaves and stuff. And when she wakes up in the spring, she's hungry. She hasn't had any coffee. She's in a serious bad mood, all right? Needless to say. And these orchids are in bloom, and there's a couple others that the queen bumblebee pollinate. This one actually accommodates the bumblebee quite nicely. You can see how you've got a hood and then you've got a labellum, and she can stick her fat body right in there towards that black spot. Now, this is where the grumpy part comes in. There's no nectar reward. So she's going to be attracted to this because she's grumpy, she's hungry, she's just awakened from her form of hibernation. She wants food. So she will usually go to quite a few of these before she finally figures out she's not getting a reward, and she moves on. But the pollinator is several different kinds of queen bumblebees. I thought you'd enjoy that. Next slide, please. All right, so conservation status, globally secure, although it is rare in the northern end of its range, New England states, and it is considered vulnerable in other areas. So central Maryland is covered pretty good, northern Virginia covered pretty good. As we get out to Garrett County in the panhandle of Maryland, you can see it doesn't particularly like the mountainous areas so much, and not into the West Virginia until you get down more into lowlands. A little bit in Delaware, again in New Jersey, and in southern Pennsylvania. So trekking is usually pretty good for these. Again, if you have a patch in your conservation area, the deer love to eat this. I mean, they will eat it down to nothing. So you want to cage them. And I usually recommend galvanized stalk fencing in a circle, maybe 3 to 4 feet in diameter, and about 5.5 feet tall. And then stake it in with rebar or metal fencing posts so that they can't be pushed over. And that way you can protect them. Next slide, please. All right. Now, these come in white. So you can see that they're bicolored. The labellum, the lip, the downward facing part is white. And then the petals and sepals are that pretty lavender color. But occasionally we find a pure white one, which is always a fun find. So they do occur in nature. And again, these are one that they do not transplant. They just don't. Their symbiosis with their microecology is just too tight. You can't move them. If you have to transplant them, they're usually very, very short-lived. They also are not taking well to any form of artificial propagation. So we're not finding these even in the specialty market trade. So not commonly found for sale, don't transplant well. So again, we have to rely on protecting them from predation against deer and protecting the habitat. These can be abundant in certain areas for trekking. I think I can tell a location without, because it's so big. I like to go to the G. Richard Thompson Wildlife Management Area near Linden, Virginia, and you'll see a lot of these. But there are several nice areas in state parks in Maryland as well. So you can find them trekking, but don't dig them, don't pick them. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to switch from mesic forests, and we're going to put on our hip boots, and we're going to go into bogs and wet meadows. But before we do that, does anybody have any questions?
Sorry, Carol, there was one comment earlier from Skip that said there was a nice patch, but I forget which orchid you were showing at the time. He said there was a nice patch on the left side of the C&O Canal as you walk from Carter Rock to Widewater upriver. But I think that was very early on in the presentation. So
it was probably a plectrum or tipularia. We have a lot of patches of tipularia around here. I think because it's most showy in the wintertime, you don't have people hassling with it, all right? You don't have people fooling with it. So yeah, there are good patches around, and if you like that nice day in January when you have to get out of the house, that's when you want to go look for them. All right, thank you very much.
Carol?
Yeah.
It was, I took notes because I want to go see it. It was the putty root orchid. The buckham, something,
okay.
I can't read my handwriting.
Okay, Stephanie, thank you. All right.
Actually, Carol, sorry, Mary Beth then just wrote, do you ever go trekking trips in real life? Do you ever do trekking trips in real life?
I haven't done trekking trips in years. Usually I just go with one or two buddies. Most of the places that I go looking for wild orchids, and I do it on a regular basis, it's like annually, I have my places that I go. They're not set up for people. You know, they're just groups who would just trample everything. Audubon used to sponsor some lovely wildflower treks in the springtime, and I don't know that they still do, but that would be a question for Saranella. Are there trips? I don't anymore, because most of the areas I go, the habitat is too fragile for groups. I'm sorry. All right, I'm going to put on my hip boots, and I'm going to go to bogs and wet meadows. So if you've ever been in a bog or a wet meadow, it's got it, Bev. Thank you. It's a difficult place to traverse. You've got sphagnum hummocks, and you're kind of leaping from hummock to hummock, trying not to step on things. And everywhere you look, it's a pitcher plant or a sundew or it's an orchid, and it's just crazy wonderful. So we're going to look at Platanthera ciliaris, yellow fringed orchid. And these guys you probably are not going to see until they are in bloom. So your plant height can get over 1 meter tall, although usually I see them about 2 feet. And they are yellow orange. There is absolutely no question when you look at those as to what you're looking at. They are winter dormant. They're a summer treat. So you're going to go in that wet meadow and bog when the ticks and the mosquitoes are just at their peak, June through August, and having a good time. What you're going to see, though, is memorable, because the designated pollinator for these guys are some of our favorite big butterflies, monarchs and swallowtails, and a lot of other butterflies will feed on these orchids. Next slide, please. All right. Conservation status, you can see, having looked at some of the maps previously, we don't have as many green areas, and it's downright rare in the western edge of its range. Locally, you can find them in central Maryland a little bit in northern Virginia, Delaware, New Jersey. Pine Barrens is a pretty good place to look, and Pennsylvania. I'm going to talk about 2 more Platanthera, and all of them suffer greatly from deer predation. So this is a place, if you know that it's there, you've got to corral them with fencing to keep them from getting eaten by the deer. Next slide, please. All right, so now, woohoo, these are being artificially propagated. And now I can honestly say that look to your carnivorous plant growers, all right? They are propagating the Platantheras, and these guys, when they're artificially propagated, not transplanted, they're not gonna live long. But if you create a home bog, this is one that you can actually buy from, artificially propagated from a supplier, and plant it with your pitcher plants, and there are some other orchids that will grow nicely in a home bog. But the transplanted orchids, again, site differences. If you think you've got a wet meadow that it can go into, you may not have the appropriate microbial association. Next slide, please. Okay, lesser purple fringed orchid. Now we have a greater purple fringed orchid and a lesser purple fringed orchid. Yeah, and unless you're really, really good at telling them apart, you're just happy to see a purple fringed orchid in the wild. I have seen both of them, and I know the differences, and my heart just beats faster. You can see that they're this lovely pink. They get almost to 1 meter high, about 2.5 feet high. Their bloom time is July through August. Their pollinators are hummingbird moths, swallowtail butterflies, and a host of others. You can find an alba form, a pure white form that is naturally occurring. And if you have a big enough stand, you're going to see a lot of genetic variation in the amount of pink in these things. So it's just a wonder to be there and see these through the bog and wet meadows. It's just amazing. Next slide, please. Okay, so conservation status is considered globally secure, although it is rare in central and western states, and it is extirpated in Maryland. So you're going to say, oh, wait a minute, I see some green things in Maryland. All right, well, this is a USDA map, and I think that its data is maybe not as good as we'd like. The best place to see where these plants might be found is the Maryland Biodiversity Project. So if you think you've seen one or the other, check with the Maryland Biodiversity Project, because you may be seeing the one that means it's back in Maryland. So I use Maryland Biodiversity Project to double check my USDA maps for where I'm going to find them. Next slide, please. So not commonly found for sale. This one is not artificially propagated. I think that they've tried to artificially propagate it, probably the carnivorous plant people, and it's not been taken to artificial propagation. So again, this is one, don't dig it. If you find it, protect it against deer, protect the habitat, and enjoy it. Next slide, please. So now greater purple fringed orchid. And if you're sharp-eyed, you're going to notice that when you look where all the fringes come together and that white area, and there's this opening that looks like a big open mouth. All right, that's the beginning of where the nectar source is. All right, and I've got, I think, another slide later on where we're a little bit closer, and I can tell you how this gets pollinated. So we're still in bogs and wet meadows. I've seen this in wet ditches up in West Virginia and the Panhandle of Maryland. I think Panhandle of Maryland was West Virginia. This guy gets up to 4 feet. I mean, this is considerable. It's wonderful. Blooms July through August, and our pollinators are swallowtail butterflies and a lot of other butterflies. Next slide, please. Conservation is globally secure, but still considered rare or extirpated in several of the mid-Atlantic states. And you can see the mid-Atlantic states, it's really kind of naked in there. So we have to go, I was up in here, all right, in West Virginia in Garrett County, and this is where I saw them. Next slide, please. So let's talk about, see, here's that gaping mouth. That's the opening of the nectary. So this plant has a nectar reward for those butterflies. And it takes a butterfly with a long proboscis to actually get the reward. See these little dark purple things? Saranella, can you see my arrow? My cursor? Is that coming through? Maybe not. All right. So see, yeah, there we go. So orchids don't have free-ranging pollen. So you're never ever going to have an allergy to orchid pollen. Their pollen is congealed in this little glob called a pollinia. So imagine you're a butterfly coming in for a landing. Your proboscis is going to be probing that hole, and you're kind of moving around to try to get that best attitude on that nectar, and your head is going to be bumping up against those pollinia, and they are going to go whap, and they hit the poor insect in the head. They really do. And finally, they get the nectar, and they go on to the next plant. Well, the stigma, or the stigmatic surface, is right in between those two little purple hangy down things, the pollinia, right there, and the next butterfly, a little higher, Saranella. Higher. There. Oh, perfect. All right, stigmatic surface. And as that butterfly jockeys for position to get the proboscis into nectary, those pollinia come off and you have pollination. Isn't that cool? I love it. All right, let's go to the next slide now that we've had our fun. All right, now let's talk, we're still in bogs and wet meadows, but we're going to talk about some plants, unlike the Platanthera, that are not widely available and need more protection. We're going to talk about Pogonia ophioglossoides, or rose pogonia. And this is a happy story, all right? These are small. Your plant height is probably, I usually see them about 2.5 feet. And you can see that little flower looks like an orchid. You go, yeah, that could be a little Cattleya or something, all right? Blooms May through August. It has a slender stem with a couple, or usually one, small grassy leaf. So if it's not in bloom, you're not going to see it because it's going to grow in association with the bog grasses, all right? Pollinator is several species of bumblebees. And next slide, please. And you can see, although it may be globally secure, it is rare and vulnerable throughout much of its range. So you can see in Maryland and Northern Virginia, West Virginia's got a couple of patches. Southern Maryland has some patches. Over on the shore, we have a couple of small patches, Delaware and into New Jersey. Next slide, please. Oh, this is easy to grow in the home bog orchid, or home bog garden. Thank heavens. So when carnivorous plant growers, and these people are serious conservationists, when they rescue pitcher plants in the face of a swamp or a wetland being drained, they will take a sod, and in that sod will be rose pogonia. Well, it also grows pretty easily from seed. I mean, easily it's said in quotes because we're talking about orchids here. So you can get artificially propagated rose pogonia, which you can grow in the home bog garden, right next to your native pitcher plants. And I'm going to say that it's probably easily moved if it's threatened. So this is one you can do in the home garden. Full sun bog garden with your pitcher plants, and it will thrive. Next slide, please. All right, now we again, kind of the same foliage that you would have with the rose pogonia. You've got grass-like single leaf. Your plants, 24 inches maybe, May through August. And bees are the ones that pollinate this. Next slide, please. All right, conservation status, globally secure, widespread, frequent through much of its range. All right, northern edge of its range, it's a little not as common. And you can see in Maryland and Northern Virginia and West Virginia, not as common. You get out towards the shore, Delaware, and like the Pine Barrens, you'll find them a little bit in Southern Maryland, but they're more, you're going to find them more on the shore in our area. Next slide, please. Okay, so I told you how the greater fringed orchid, all right, is purple fringed orchid is pollinated. This one pollinates by deception. And a lot of orchids pollinate by deception. They're conniving little critters, all right? By the way, this is easy to grow in the home bog. It is artificially propagated. You can get it from carnivorous plant growers, all right? And it's probably easily moved. But let me explain what we have going on here. So I have mentioned the labellum, the lip on an orchid. And if I had an orchid here, I could show you easily. This plant is a non-recuperant. So the labellum is up top. So Serenella, right, can you see where that fuzzy white stuff is right there? Come down, 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 more down. You could do that one, but I like this one better. To your left. Yep, okay. See the fuzzy white stuff there? And if you look really closely, it's got a little yellow base, and it's sticking up there looking like, you know, looking like anthers. Like pollen is there because it's yellow. And this bee goes, yummy, 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 I've got food. And they fly into that fuzzy stuff thinking, oh, those are anthers and somewhere around here there is pollen. But fool him, because this whole apparatus, the whole labellum, from the tippy top of the purple part all the way down to where the darker purple part is hinged. And when he lands on what looks like stamens, his weight pulls the whole thing over and he is slapped into the lower part down here. So Serenella, look, go to the white part down below. More, more, more. There, okay? That's where the stigmatic surface is. And he gets whapped into where the pollinia and the stigmatic surface. And of course, he's going, what happened to me? All right? And while he's kind of writhing around and trying to get his bearings again, the pollinia end up sticking to his head. Well, bees have very small brains. And he's going to go to another orchid, and he's going to be fooled and say, oh, look at those white stamens and that yellow stuff. I bet it's pollen. He tries it again with another calopogon, gets whapped back down into the stigmatic surface, loses his little headgear of pollinia, and you have pollination. So sneaky, devious plant. I love them. Next slide, please. All right, this is blooming right now. All right, its bloom time is late summer to early fall, and we have our hip waders on. This time, this plant has about 1 to 5 leaves, basal leaves, kind of grass-like, and then the inflorescence rises up sometimes to 24 inches. Usually I see it about 12 to 18. They're pollinated by several species of bumblebee. Next slide, please. And we've got some pretty good coverage here. You can see central Maryland, Maryland up towards the Pennsylvania border into Pennsylvania, Delaware, you've got Eastern Shore, you've got Northern Virginia, you've got Panhandle of West Virginia. So these are considered pretty globally secure. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is common in your better retail nurseries in the perennial department. It is artificially propagated. You can buy this and feel free that you're no guilt on this. It is easily divided or grown from seed. And if you are so lucky to see an area where these are and it is threatened with a bulldozer, they can be successfully moved. These will do okay in a bog, but they kind of like more of a moist garden. So if you've got Lobelia cardinalis blooming well, this would be a good companion plant. Next slide, please. All right, let's talk about the lady slippers because that's what you guys are waiting for. All right, pink moccasin flower. Oh my gosh, we love this. And now we've taken off our hip boots and we're back into dry mixed forests. These have very distinctive leaves, and the leaves come up very, very early in the spring, late April, and they're probably still there now, about to disappear in the next like 8 weeks. So you can tell where you've got a patch of these. You can see that it's associated in this picture with ferns and lycopodium. So that's kind of the area. Although I have to tell you, this particular plant is found in a wide range of habitats, everything from under pine trees to hardwood forests. And that's because it has a very tight symbiosis with the mycorrhizal fungi, but it's a little bit indiscriminate as to which mycorrhizal fungi it wants to hang with. So it's actually been found to hang, and Saranella can probably tell you more than I can, of which, I think it's a Basidiomycota that it likes to hang with, but don't quote me on that. Saranella's going to know better. All right, this is winter dormant. I see them in that window between May 1 and May 10, or Mother's Day. And the queen bumblebee, again, is the pollinator. And remember, she's been dormant over winter. She wakes up grumpy and hungry. And there's not much out there for her to be attracted to. So the inside of the slipper has a slit in it. And she thinks, oh, that's where the goodies are going to be. So she gets down in the pouch. The problem there is the only way out is up the back side of the flower, where if, Saranella, can you put your pointer on? See that little, looks like a little mustard seed? And go to the white one. At the top of the flower, you see that little mustard seed-like thing? All right. That is the pollinia. And the way nature put this together is that the insect is supposed to go up the back side of the pouch. They see daylight. Thank you, Saranella, right there. They see daylight, the winter little opening, and they're supposed to come out and pick up the pollinia and then go to the next flower and do it again. But remember I said the queen bumblebee, she wakes up, she doesn't have her coffee, she's really unhappy. So one of the problems with this orchid is low pollination, because the queen bumblebee just chews her way through the side of the pouch. And pollination does not occur. So this is actually a big problem in population maintenance. Next slide, please. All right, so you can see it looks pretty widespread, doesn't it? Yeah. And I'd like to say that its status is globally secure and it is common throughout much of its range, but it has that persistent low reproductive rate. That's why, all right? It has such an incredibly tight symbiosis with its fungus that it can stay dormant and underground. It's been tracked to be underground for as long as 2 decades. Yeah, I said 20 years. Before it gets strong enough, getting its carbon from the fungus to be able to be strong enough and put an above ground structure up and a flower. So it's got a really, really wonderfully strange life cycle. That's why if you go back to a patch and it doesn't bloom this year, and it doesn't bloom this year, and then maybe next year, flowers everywhere. All right, that's why. It'll actually spend part of its life cycle underground, hanging out with the fungi. Next slide, please. All right. So there has been some artificial propagation done on this plant. It's not adapted well to being lived in the ground. So people have been able to do pot culture. You can buy artificially propagated plants. Buyer beware though, if it's inexpensive and it's on eBay, yes, the fungi get carbon. And it's not parasitism, but that's a talk for another time. That's one Saranella and I can play with. So it's probably been wild collected if it's inexpensive. So buyer beware. Even in the face of bulldozers, this does not move well. So all we can do is protect it against deer predation and protect habitat. Next slide, please. So the pink one, that's bad news. We can't really artificially propagate it. It doesn't make it, that transition from artificial propagation into soil is rocky. But when you get into the yellow lady slippers, we have much better skill, flexibility on the plant's part. So Cypripedium parviflorum, variety parviflorum, and there are 3 subspecies. I have seen 2 out of the 3. I feel good. All right, this is lesser yellow lady slipper, and it is characterized by a little bit of a smaller flower, and the sepals and petals are darker maroon. Now we're still in rich mesic forests. you can have, now you've got a different growth pattern too. You've got a stem, and then you've got your veined leaves coming alternately up the stem, terminating in the flower. Up to 30 inches, I usually see them about 24. Bloom time, April through June. I see them again in that window, May 1st to Mother's Day. And the pollinator here is small bees. Next slide, please. Globally secure, common or widespread throughout much of its range. It's limited in its, this subspecies is limited in its distribution to the central mid-Atlantic. So the subspecies break out usually by where in the range that they fall. Next slide, please. All right, this is available, artificially propagated. Occasionally you can see it offered as wild collected. Again, the vendor should be perfectly proud to tell you how he got that orchid. If he didn't, walk away. If it's inexpensive, it's probably in wild collected. If you can site it correctly, this plant actually makes a good garden subject. But note here, I say that the soil has to be sufficiently mature. So soils take thousands of years to evolve. And as they evolve, organic matter adding to the mineral component, you've got the microecology working. Now that soil would be ready for a lady slipper orchid. So it's not something that you can add, you know, some leaf grow to your clay soil in the shade and plant these and expect them to live. It takes what I call a mature soil. So that's the downside. But if you have a woodland site, protect it from Bambi, because the deer eat these like they were Godiva. You could buy an artificially propagated plant and have some good luck with it. Next slide, please. So I told you there were a couple of different subspecies. This is Cypripedium parviflorum pubescens. It's the greater yellow lady slipper, and you can see that the petals and the sepals are a lighter color, and if you had them side by each, the pouch is much larger. And again, we're still in rich mesic forests. It's got 5 leaves that march up the stem, again, very distinctively veined. This one gets a little bit taller. I have seen it almost to 30 inches. And again, that May window is usually when I see it blooming. And a carpenter bee. So you thought carpenter bees were good for nothing. It's a pollinator of this orchid. Next slide, please. Conservation status, globally secure, but you can see it's not really in southern Maryland or Virginia. It kind of goes a little bit north into central Maryland and northern Maryland, not quite to the panhandle, a little bit of northern Delaware, Pennsylvania, and into West Virginia, where you can find it a little bit more easily. All right, next slide, please. All right, this is a good garden subject. It is available through artificial propagation, but again, that buyer beware. If it's cheap, it's probably wild collected. But again, you're going to need that mature soil and proper siting, but a beautiful thing when it blooms. Next slide, please. Cypripedium kentuckiense. Yeah, I know, this is the Kentucky lady slipper. Why am I talking about it? Well, because, all right, no, it's not really found outside of Kentucky and a few parts of Tennessee, but this is a very large slipper orchid. That flower is a handful. It's quite beautiful. Up to about 38 inches tall. Blooms April, May here. Looper moth and carpenter bees is its designated pollinator. Next slide, please. Yeah, Kentucky, Tennessee, Atlanta. Why am I talking about it? Next slide, please. Because it's available, artificially propagated, and I find that this, of all of our native orchids on the East Coast, this one usually makes a good garden subject. But you want to buy an artificially propagated plant. You still need to have some good mature soil. Transplanting, we're not going to have the opportunity because we're not even near its habitat, its native habitat, which is diminishing, unfortunately, like a lot of them. But if you see this in the specialty nursery trade and it says artificially propagated and you say, I want to try one, This actually is a pretty good plant. It's a little bit more robust and more capable of being a garden-worthy plant. Next slide, please. All right, Cypripedium reginae. Well, this is showy lady slipper, and this is the one we wish we could have. Next to the pink lady slipper, this is the one everybody goes, ooh, I want that. We're back to bogs and wet meadows. This has the same growth habit as the yellow lady slippers and as the Kentucky lady slipper. Has those big veined leaves that march up the stem. This is a big mama. She can get up to 39 inches, almost a full meter. I find around here, if you can find it, and you're not going to find it around here anymore, it blooms a little bit more towards the summer, and it's pollinated by medium-sized bees. Let's go to the next slide and take a look at its range. All right, not around here, okay? Definitely up into Michigan and upstate New York, a little bit into Pennsylvania, all right? Its conservation status is globally secure, but it's rare throughout most of its southern range. We did have a patch in Maryland. I'm afraid that an individual has not been found in that patch for a very, very long time, probably close to 20 years. Next slide, please. Okay, so a lot of work has been done to try to artificially propagate this lady slipper. You can get it artificially propagated from specialty nurseries. However, buyer beware. It does not like our heat and humidity, and that's why you don't find it happy in the mid-Atlantic states. It prefers a more neutral soil pH, and our mother soil usually errs more towards the decidedly acid. So you'd have to have just the right site with the right everything. And I don't see how you're going to get around the heat and humidity, at least not here in central mid-Atlantic states. So even though up further north, I know I have friends who have purchased artificial propagated plants and they do well with them. They don't have our heat and humidity. And again, don't transplant, it's not going to work. But it's not here, so not our problem. Next slide, please. All right, so how do they do that? Well, it isn't easy, all right? So starting in the upper left-hand corner, that is a miniature negative pressure hood so that air can never be sucked into it, and we have to sterilize the entire inner surface. The seed is like talcum powder, literally, I'm not exaggerating, tiny, tiny. It's, if you go the lower left picture, you can see you have an Erlenmeyer flask on a brown, that's an agar-based medium that contains sugars for nutrients, vitamins, usually plant hormones, and we can germinate the seeds there. And we get these little zombie plants, those little white zombie plants, those protocorms, and they will mature to a point where we can prick them out and put them into a seedling flat, like the center picture, and grow them on and grow them on. And from seed to young plant, still 2 to 3 years away from blooming, you're probably talking about anywhere from 3 to 5 years. Yeah, 3 to 5 years. They're difficult to propagate. The potential for contamination, even in a sterile negative pressure hood, is really pretty good. And then you have to get them to transfer from that agar-based nutrient where they've got everything they need to soil, and you'll lose a lot there. Next slide, please. So if you want this kind of look in your garden, we do have suppliers that have hybridized, and these plants have more hybrid vigor. They're going to be a better garden-worthy subject. You certainly don't dig them out of the wild because you're doomed, probably doomed to failure. But we do have sources of supply for hybrid plants, and they are readily available. Next slide, please. All right, Serenella is going to have this, so don't try to copy it real fast. But these locations do have artificially propagated lady slippers and some of the other orchids that we talked about. All right, next slide, please. All right, and some photo acknowledgements because I borrowed heavily. All right, and some source material there, and I'll take some questions.
Okay, great. Let's see. Tom had a few questions. He wondered if orchards bloom every year, or will they take a year off if they don't have energy reserves?
Maybe. I'm sorry. You know, there's so many different kinds. Definitely the pink lady slipper is infamous for taking time off. So when I go trekking in late April, and that's the first lady slipper that blooms around here is the pink one, I've got my stomping sites, and my buddy and I will go out, and we've been trekking the same area for, oh my gosh, I'd say a decade. So we know we've got boom and bust years, and it's on a Pepco cut. So sometimes Pepco gets stomping in there, trimming things and dumping things, and we get angry at them. But yeah, so yes, they have boom and bust years. A lot of the other orchids, I would say, are pretty consistent, but weather is always a factor. Some years more, some years less.
And he also wondered about, he asked, do the fungi get anything, or is it pure parasitism?
No, it's a symbiotic relationship, symbiotic,
okay.
Because when the plant is going to photosynthesize, and it's going to make sugars and starches, and the fungus get the sugars and starches. The plant has an increased nutrient and water uptake due to the mycelium of the fungus. So it is a very symbiotic relationship, except in the case of pink lady slippers, and it's kind of weird, all right? A lot of people have studied it. Everybody says, well, that's weird. But still, it's a carbon exchange. Hopefully photosynthesis, sugars from the plant, the fungus gets that. But then in the pink lady slippers, they can be sustained for years just on the fungal reserves. So it's not a parasitic relationship. It is symbiotic, but sometimes it's weird. There is, I mean, if you guys want to go into Google Scholar or Web of Science, there's actually, people have been researching about this symbiosis between orchids and fungi for decades. I mean, it goes back for years and years and years. And there's really some fascinating work actually being done out. What's the Smithsonian out on the shore? I just had one of those mature moments. Yeah, but anyway, there are...
Cirque.
Yeah, Cirque, yes. There's some wonderful folks out there that I know that are doing amazing work.
Yeah.
Okay.
On September 23rd, we will have Priscilla Chaveri speaking about symbiotic fungi, especially with coffee plants. But she also, symbiosis is very near and dear to her heart. And she has been studying different symbionts, fungal symbionts for a number of years. So if you really want to know more about these amazing organisms and their connections, join us for September 23rd.
Yeah, and to answer Bev's question, because I saw it very briefly, showy orchis and showy orchid are both acceptable. So both names, that's not a typo. Any more questions?
I would like to invite the audience to either ask your question in the chat or via using your voice. Okay. If that is all, I just want to thank you, Carol. This was wonderful, and loved seeing all the different orchids that are not only close to us, but also available for our gardens. Would the audience like to join me in thanking you as well?
Oh. Thank you, guys.
Wonderful.
Thank you very, very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for being a great audience.
Thank you.
Thank you.